Good morning, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the third annual World Bank Conference on Development in Africa, this year on urbanization, jointly organized with, as far as I can tell, most of Oxford and parts of LSE as well. So welcome, everyone. I'm Marcus Goldstein from the World Bank, and I'll just give you a couple of housekeeping organizational things to get us started before we turn over to our opening session. The way we're going to be organized is the plenary sessions will be in here, and the breakout sessions will be directly across there, 2 seminar rooms. We will be using seminar rooms 3 and 4, so anything that says seminar room 2 in the program, which you should have, just multiply by 2, okay? So anything that's in 2 is in 4. 3 is still in 3, okay. So this morning we're gonna have an opening session right here, right now. There'll be a coffee break after, and then lunch, then there'll be parallel sessions in the 2 seminar rooms. Housing market will be in seminar room 4, and infrastructure and services will be in seminar room 3. Lunch will be served here in the main space, and then afterwards we will come back here for an invited panel. There'll be a coffee break, more parallel sessions, and then afterwards, at the end of the day, there'll be dinner served again here. It was supposed to be outside, but if any of you've looked out the window, we've decided to move it inside for the evening. Presenters, before your session, please, there's breaks before every session, so please be there 5 minutes beforehand to load your presentations onto the computer so we don't have the confluence at the beginning. Thank you all for coming, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Chief Economist for the Africa region, Albert Zufak, to get us started.
Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
Very good. My name is Albert Zufak. I'm the Chief Economist for Africa at the World Bank. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be here this morning, opening this session on the 3rd edition of the Africa Bank Annual Conference, ABCA. ABCA is, for those of you who know about the ABCDE, the annual bank conference on development economics at the World Bank. MACTA had the idea a couple of years ago to launch this series of conference focused on Africa. And the whole purpose is to raise the quality of analytical work on Africa on themes that are pertinent to African development. The other objective is to actually get luminaries to focus on Africa. And this morning, we have the pleasure of having in this room some of the brightest minds in our profession who would have had the chance to take a closer look at the issue of urbanization. The third theme of this, the theme of this third ABCA is urbanization. The second ABCA that took place in Berkeley was on fragility, political economy. And the first one, which took place in Paris at the Paris School of Economics, was extremely important in launching all the discussion in economic development for African countries. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing 2 extremely important people. On my left is the Vice President of Africa at the World Bank, Maktar Diop. Maktar has been in the development business for a while. He has been finance minister of Senegal. And before that, he has done something most of us really do not appreciate, his work for the IMF. But you know, he came back to his senses and crossed the road, and since then, he's become really, really good. Maktar has been the Vice President of Africa for the past 4 years, and he has definitely really changed the agenda, and he has pushed analytical work to new heights in the bank. And Maktar, for those of you who know him, is a passionate economist. Maktar, you know, is always challenging us to raise the quality of our analytical work. And my biggest challenge, being the chief economist of Africa, is to keep up with him. But it's great. It's wonderful working with Maktar. So we'll have Maktar to give us the opening speech for this conference. To my right is somebody we cannot, what I would say, somebody who needs no introduction. Ed Glazer, as some of you would have recognized him. Ed is a professor in Harvard University. Ed is you know, the Fred and Eleanor Glim Professor at the Faculty of Art and Science at Harvard, and he's been teaching in Harvard since 1992. Ed has published dozens of papers and books on cities and economic growth, and some of his most known titles are The Triumph of the City in 2011, whom most of you have read, I'm sure. And Ed has also published this seminal book on cities, agglomeration, and spatial equilibrium. His work has really focused on the determinants of city growth and the role of cities as centers of economic transformation. And what he has contributed greatly so far is to a better formulation of urban land use theory with important implications on how we think about the prevalence of urban poverty, an issue particularly important to African cities. Well, before I hand over to Maktar, and for those of you wondering why we chose urbanization at the theme of this conference, I would just want to say that the Africa region of the World Bank has been doing you know, serious analytical work in the past couple of years, and we're coming up soon with a report on urbanization. And this is a theme that is absolutely important to African development in at least you know, 2 ways. One is African cities are growing and growing fast. In the next 25 years, there will be more than 1 billion people living in African cities. Today, we have close to 500 million people living in African cities. So this is a serious, this is a very, very important point, because, you know, if we are to eradicate poverty in Africa, we need to focus not only in rural areas, but we need to see what is happening in urban areas as well. The second reason why urbanization is important is because when well managed, cities can be an engine of innovation and growth. Cities can be the center for innovation. Cities can be the platform for economic diversification in Africa. So with these few words, I would like to call on Maktar to give us the opening speech for this conference. So join me in welcoming Maktar, please.
Good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. And Paul and I were exchanging jokes and about me wearing tie or not. I came here hoping that I can have this conference without a tie, and he told me, you know, it's always adverse selection. We think that we are that bureaucrats, when you go to academia, we can't stay without a tie, and the opposite is happening. When academics are coming to bureaucrats, they're wearing ties, because so maybe someone should write a game theory model around that and have a little bit of fun. It's a delight and a pleasure to be here, to welcome you at the third annual conference that we are organizing. As Albert said, it's a conference that we've launched 4 years ago. It was for me important, as I took the responsibility for Vice President for Africa, to make sure that we link policymaking and academic work. And we started with PSC on poverty, after follow with a conference with Berkeley on conflict, and this time is with Oxford on urban. And next year the theme will be most likely on agriculture. We haven't yet confirmed the institution with which we will be coupling. I know that we are talking about Cornell or other places, but we will confirm that as we get closer to it. For us, it's very important. People have been talking about the pace of urbanization, and I would like, just before starting, say my 2-3 words to introduce the topic, to say how I'm delighted to be here. I remember with Paul, I don't want to say how many decades ago, we were, the first years of the Center of African Studies, the conference that were here, and I had the chance at that time to present a couple of papers, and it was a pleasure to see again, to come back here. And it's interesting to see how the change and the discussion has changed. At that time, we were all focusing about macro issues and macro instability. We were running, everybody was excited, running time series analysis on inflation dynamics in Africa, or these kind of things. And today is a different world. It's a world where people have been looking at much more at micro issues and trying to understand a little bit the micro dynamic and productivity. I remember also at that time, it was the beginning of the launching also work on firm competitiveness and firm productivity. And it took a peak, and at some point was a bit abandoned. And I think now all these things are coming back together, looking at the macro vulnerability issues, but in a context of economies which are much more resilient and which are trying to increase productivity. So we are at a particular time right now in Africa where we are starting registering a little bit of slowdown after a decade of growth at 5%. And Professor Kube has been very much involved in that discussion about what it means, this 5% growth, and how the distribution of it has been done. And we have the last projections that we made, actually it's just last week, reviewing the growth projection for Africa. We talk about 2.5% growth, slightly above the annual growth, the growth rate of the rest of the world, which will be 2.4. We had a growth rate in Africa which was twice higher than the world growth rate. This year, it will be very close to what is happening in the rest of the world. And you can see that the slowdown in Africa has been even stronger in the large economies. And these are things that will be interesting. It has been much slower in the countries which are large, commodity-related, but also more urbanized. So if you look at Nigeria, Angola, and South Africa, are countries which are more urbanized, but which will be having a growth rate this quarter around 0.6% for one, another one 0.8, another one 0.9. So very, very close, below actually the population growth rate. So it means per capita negative growth. And it's interesting to think about those countries, not only as countries being large economic and exporting commodities, but we also don't think about it about countries which are also high level of urbanization. And I think it tells us a little bit about what has been the driver of growth in Africa. We have a growth which has been based on factor accumulation, but factor accumulation and low productivity and factor accumulation in sectors which are highly linked to commodities. Therefore, since activities in the cities are largely linked to non-oil sectors and where the growth could be much more linked to productivity, it's not a surprise that this slowdown in commodity prices is also affected the growth that you had in those large countries, but also these countries are largely urbanized. So we have here the discussion about what is the productivity, what is of our large cities in Africa, and I think this is the reason why it's important to focus on this discussion today. Focusing on the discussion also will, for me, link very much the issue of structural transformation that we're talking about so much in Africa right now to the issue of what is happening in the cities, because the productivity gains that we expect will be essentially coming from the non-commodity sectors and hopefully benefiting from agglomeration and transmission of technology and technology adoption in the context of cities. So let's keep something in mind. We have a large country, large cities, which have been growing slower in Africa in this last year than the rest of countries which have been less urbanized. And it tells us something about productivity growth in Africa and the technical factor productivity in the various segments of the economy. And I think that is very much highlighted by the fact that the rebasing of most of the economies that we have in Africa as a GDP has been showing that the informal sector and the services have been the main source of growth of the GDP in Africa. And we know that the informal sector in Africa has a very low level of productivity, and therefore we can understand that with low level of accumulation in that sector, which is services in informal sector and low productivity, we can, in a context of lower commodity prices, in a commodity exporters country, start facing a slowdown, and so therefore the need to really focus on productivity gain in urban setting and in a more diverse economy. I will not say anything about how important agglomeration is. I will be full of myself talking in front of Egglands about the impact of the importance of agglomeration in terms of productivity increase and technological adoption. I'm sure that he will tell you much more than I can tell you on this matter. But the point that Paul and other colleagues are making is that it's a conditional proposition. If you don't have good cities, this benefit of agglomeration and productivity growth will not be there. So we need to think really about the development of African cities. And what we can see is that African urbanization is on a low development path. So it's not that we are seeing cities which are growing fast with high productivity growth, but we are cities which are growing in a way which is a bit messy with underemployment, where, like Chantal was saying, informal is normal, where you have a high level of informality, very low formal employment, and very low factor productivity growth. So we need really to think about what are the conditions which will allow to unleash really the potential of growth in Africa. So let me just say something about the dynamics between growth and demographics and urbanization. We talk a lot about cities in Africa in terms of urbanization and demographic growth, in terms of internal migration from rural areas to urban areas. I think that there is a question that we might want to ask ourselves as we move in that situation of larger cities, is urbanization affect the household decision in terms of fertility? And I think it's an important question to ask ourselves, because the initial data seems to be indicating that we don't have significant difference in terms of fertility rate and demographic rates in the urban settings and in the rural space. What does it tell us about African cities? I think it's very important to think about it, because it has very important fiscal implications. It has very important technological adoption implication. It has a lot of implication in terms of the main constraints that we are facing in cities productivity, which is land access. So our household in Africa, in the context of high urbanization, making different decisions when they are in a non-urban setting. This is a question that I haven't seen a lot of work done, but I really would love to see a bit more work. Is it affecting intra-household allocation? Is it affecting a certain number of things? Secondly, looking at it, we have also in service delivery provision in urban setting to think about what is fertility and the access to services in health will have as an impact on population in urban population in Africa. We certainly have a life expectancy which will be increasing significantly in urban setting. We will start having a type of diseases that are not now common in Africa as a rural space, cardio, heart disease, cancer, etc. And that will put also another important pressure on things. Why? Because all the processed goods are much more easily available in urban setting, and they have obviously the impact on obesity on all these things. So the story of Mexico needs to be kept in mind when you think also about urbanization and look at the nexus between fertility, demographics, but also provision of health services. You talked a lot. I'm coming from Nairobi, which is the city where we have the largest, one of the largest slums in Africa, and it's clear that working around slums and ensuring that the migration of rural people in the urban space is done in a way where there is planning of space, there is good land management, and I think Ed will certainly tell us a lot about it, and where we take also condition to reduce the cost of registration, the cost of management of land, and to create a secondary market on land, which is not always the case. So another challenge that we are facing is the issue of fiscal sustainability and financial sustainability of cities in Africa. One of the reasons is the low income per capita that you have in Africa in cities, which is very different from other countries that have been urbanizing with a much higher income per capita. But there is another dimension maybe that we need to also emphasize, is the political economy around tax collection in the cities in Africa. If you look at any budget in Africa, you will see that the real estate tax collection is very low, it's extremely low. Basically, it's close to nil. And it tells you a lot about the political economy which is behind it. As we're talking about this fiscal sustainability of African cities, one of the low-hanging fruits that I see is really to push much harder in terms of property tax collection in Africa, and to have also, in the context of fiscal federalism for countries like Kenya, which have now, with devolution, a very decentralized country, to have a mechanism where resources are really kept at the county, at the city level, to be able to make the optimal investment. And that's a very complex question, because if you take the experience of Brazil, where we had a lot of the devolution have given a lot of responsibility to the municipalities, but they don't have the tax base to be able to sustain those service delivery, and rely exclusively on central government to be able to make those investments. So what can we learn from that experience in the context of Africa? Another two questions, because we are today in the world of climate change, in terms of productivity increase that we will have in the cities, what will be the path that we would like to take? Is it the Beijing path, or is it the path of a city which is greener, which is able to have much less impact on the environment and on pollution in particular? And I think that there is something that we need to think about in terms of leapfrogging, which type of transportation, which type of exchange of goods, which type of exchange of information we want to have in new cities in Africa, so that we minimize the impact on things like environment, climate change, etc., and see if we can do some leapfrogging by using technology in the context. So the question that I would like to raise here is that, do we want to do the urbanization following exactly the same steps as some countries have taken, with all the negative externalities that we have, or there is a way to find a different path, learning from the lessons of Mexico, of Beijing, of other places, to really have a path which is different and which allow us to move in a much more faster way and a more sustainable urbanization. Let me stop by talking briefly about secondary cities. which is for me very important in African context. As we're talking about structural transformation of African economies, I do believe that secondary cities are crucial in doing that for many reasons. They will help in having the transformation of raw material closer to the production side and reducing the transaction cost of moving goods in Africa, and therefore increasing the competitiveness and efficiency of our economies. And it also will help on increasing the value chain in Africa by having a more specialization of cities in Africa. But also it will help us think of some things that if you do some gravity model stuff in Africa, you realize that the borders don't tell us a lot. In fact, if you look at the trade around the borders between two countries, you realize that the cities which are there are much more connected to cities which are on those sides of the borders. So thinking about a secondary city, cities which are outside the capital cities are engine of growth, but not only within the borders of the country, but in terms of regional pools, it will be something interesting. And actually there are some data that some people have been collected by geospatial data and showing really interestingly the importance of trade between border cities in Africa. So thinking about secondary cities is something that I would like really us to focus on as we're looking at African development. So I will stop here because someone who knows about the topic is here, and I'm sure that you are very, very eager to hear from Ed what he will tell us about urbanization in Africa. But I think that if I want to summarize, is that it is an essential part of the structural transformation of African economies. You will not have a structural transformation without having cities which are efficient and effectively run, and which allow the proper technology adoption in countries. Second, the secondary cities in Africa will be essential because of the importance of the rural space and the continuum between the rural space and the urban space in Africa, and the fact that we are still at a lower level of technology in terms of transforming our goods. Third, think about the nexus between demographic, human development, and urbanization, how these things work together and what are the consequences. And lastly, what will be the low-hanging fruits for us to be able to make our city sustainable and improve the fiscal and governance situation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maktar. So Ed will deliver our keynote speech for this morning. Please welcome Ed.
You know, I'm really incredibly honored to be here. I can't think of anything more important than working on urbanization in Africa. And I feel particularly honored to follow that terrific opening speech. In fact, I want to start just by highlighting 4 points from that previous speech that I actually think are really important that we think about. The most obvious from a public policy point of view, and I will come back to this, is the role of property taxes, property ownership, land registration, and urban decentralization. Creating a political economy where cities can stand on their own legs, can finance themselves, and can engage in innovation. I think that's really a central point, and one that I will come back to at the end. The second point, which I think is often missed, is the importance of learning from the countries that have gone through this process earlier. And actually, I want to particularly highlight Latin America. Latin America urbanized in the 1950s and 1960s. It urbanized when it was still poor, and it faced many of the challenges that sub-Saharan Africa is facing today. Right? Latin America, not China, which in fact urbanized in a very different way, with a very different type of government, is actually a tremendous source of wisdom for urbanization. Third, I want to highlight the comment that was made about the value of doing more research on demographics and fertility in cities. Right? One of the things that's really interesting about African cities is the extent to which their growth has been fertility-driven, very high fertility rates in cities. This is a fascinating thing, it's an important thing, and it's something that we should know more about as economists. And I particularly want to highlight the work of Remy Jedwab on this. And then finally, the role of productivity in the service sector. Services really are the life's blood of cities. It's true in the West, it's true in the developing world. Understanding how to get innovation, entrepreneurship, and more productivity out of the service sector is also really important, and that also came out in those opening remarks. So thank you for those. That was really terrific. The first conversation I think I ever had in Zambia, in Lusaka, was with a senior government official who said, you know, the big challenge for urbanization in Zambia, it's to stop those poor people from coming to the city, right? That's the problem. Now, that isn't the problem. The problem is, and that's why urbanization in Africa is so important, the problem is, in fact, figuring out how to make cities humane, livable, and productive. Cities are the best path we know out of poverty. They are the best transformers of civilizations, but there are also demons that come with density, right? If two people are close enough to communicate an idea face-to-face or engage in trade, they're close enough to exchange a contagious disease. And for millennia, people have been trying to deal with these downsides of density, with contagious disease, with congestion, with high housing costs, with crime, all of which tend to come in cities. This, in some sense, ups the governance challenge when you urbanize. In some sense, an abundance of space hides many sins. But when you crowd people together in cities, you see all the failures of government. And that's why the urbanization process in Africa requires Africa to up its game in terms of government, as it does everywhere. Right? It requires better governance. It requires better management. Now, in some sense, what we're looking at here is the rise of poor world urbanization, which is a global phenomenon. What I'm showing you here is the share of countries by different income brackets, both in 1960 and 2010, that are more than one-third urbanized. The more than one-third urbanized is relatively arbitrary, but it gives you some sense that the country has a relatively urban population. And what this graph shows that in both 1960, that's the blue graph, and in 2010, about 80% of those countries with $4,000 to $5,000 of annual income are more than one-third urbanized. It's an urbanized group. Likewise, 3,000 to 4,000, actually, all of the countries in this bracket in 1960 were one-third urbanized. Today, slightly more than 80%. But let's go down to the poorest countries in the world. What share of countries in 1960 with less than $1,000 per capita GDP were more than one-third urban? Zero. None. It's an easy number to remember, right? Today, more than 40% are. Go to 1 to 2,000, you went from 20% to over 60%. An incredible change, a change unprecedented in the history of the world. For millennia, to be poor and to be rural are virtually synonymous. Now, all of a sudden, we have the growth of both places that are poor and urban. And in some sense, dealing with these poor world cities is, in fact, the great challenge of the 21st century. It's a challenge that's difficult, but it's also a challenge with tremendous upside. And anyone who's been to African cities sees that upside, sees the energy, sees the possibilities, sees the magic that occur when people are connected with one another in markets, in streets, in communities. Right? Cities enable us to become more human because our greatest talent is our ability to work with each other. So our social strength, our ability to learn from each other, our ability to trade with each other. This is what cities do that matters. Now, it's tempting to see the relationship between the rise of poor world urbanization and think that somehow or other cities have lost their economic magic. This is not so. What you're looking at here is the relationship between population growth, income growth between 1960 and 2010, and urbanization in 1960 for those countries with per capita incomes below $5,000 in 1960. So it's exactly the same sample you saw in the previous thing. A robust, strong, positive relationship. The places that were more urbanized grew more quickly. Nothing about this leads me to suggest that you should force people into cities or that you should favor urban areas disproportionately. That's not what I'm saying. But the instinct of that bureaucrat in Zambia to say, just keep the poor people home on the farms, cannot be right with this picture. It cannot be the right instinct. The right instinct must be to have cities that function better, not to keep poor people from coming to those cities. This is the relationship between urbanization and per capita income across the world. And of course, this is a well-known relationship. And it's, one way to think about this is that we crossed this halfway point where more than half of humanity lives in cities in 2007, almost a decade ago. And it's hard not to think that on net that's a good thing. When you compare those countries that are more than 50% urban to those countries that are less than 50% urban, the more urbanized countries have incomes that are 5 times higher and infant mortality levels that are less than a third. Now, what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to talk a little bit about a recent paper of mine on whether the same factors that predict success in the wealthy world also hold for 3 large developing countries. And I apologize, none of these 3 countries are in Africa. They're Brazil, India, and China, but they're the countries for which I had data. One of the motivations for this that that paper in this part of the talk is that we have a knowledge mismatch in urban economics. We have huge amounts of research on the West, right, and relatively little work on the developing world, despite the fact that there are some people, most notably Bernard Henderson, who's right here, who has been calling for decades for more work by urbanists on developing economies. But the knowledge mismatch is still enormous, and it's important that we know what things we know from the West transfer and which things do not transfer. The second thing I'm going to talk about is some new work on using computer vision techniques for measuring income, measuring property values in the developing world. One of the things we know is that when we stray away from the wealthy world, the quality of official data gets worse. And we're looking at a world in which we increasingly have things like Google Street View in places where we don't have good government statistics. And the question is, when can you use Google Street View in some sense to supplement the official statistics? The third thing I'm going to talk about is an overall need for a research agenda around dealing with the downsides of density, around the political economy, of urban troubles, around dealing with regulation, dealing with water, dealing with infrastructure. This is not an area in which we know all the right answers. It's an area in which we desperately need more research, despite the fact that the World Bank has been working on this more than anyone, better than anyone for decades. And finally, there's going to be a broad lesson here, which is cities are about interactions, good and bad. And hence institutions that moderate the downside of those interactions, that moderate the bad interactions, the contagious disease, the crime, those institutions are critical. Cities and rule of law are complements. All right, so as was mentioned, the sort of most salient fact about urbanization is the fact that people are richer in cities. This is a fact that is well known in the West, and it's a fact that it doesn't just reflect people with more education coming to cities and so forth. Now, there's, of course, a thriving literature obsessing about the extent to which the link between urban density or urban size and earnings or productivity is a reflection of an actual treatment effect of cities, or is a reflection of sorting more able people into cities. New Yorkers, like myself, particularly like to believe that their extra productivity is a reflection of their innate ability, which somehow or other has made them more productive, or whether or not it's a reflection of omitted characteristics at the place level, which both induce density and productivity. I would say the bulk of the urban literature has concluded that at least a significant fraction of this is a treatment effect of agglomeration, but there still is debate. And typically the work that's done on this involves something like looking at migrants. Ideally, we're looking at both things that are shocks to person, so something that actually moves people exogenously across place, or shocks to place. Think about the $1 million plants that Shea and Moretti do, which in some sense throws extra agglomeration into a spot and sees what happens afterwards. Now, what we're doing is not going to push the boundary at all of dealing with these issues of causality and omitted variables. We're just looking at the extent to which measured agglomeration effects, the relationship between urban size or density and income, differs between Brazil, India, and China and the US. These are what the graphs look like, and again, we've residualized with respect to individual human capital characteristics. And the coefficients you get on, these are different regressions on urban population, are really remarkably similar, ranging from about 0.05, which is the US number, doubling of density or doubling of metropolitan area size, is typically associated with that 6% extra income or 6% extra productivity, to about 0.08 in India. The density coefficients move around a little bit more. It's particularly high in China from this group, but you don't see very much from this that would cause you to think that these agglomeration benefits differ very much between the US and these other three large countries. You can also do things like using long lags of population as an instrument for population. You get very similar results, whichever way you do it. The second fact that we know quite well is the relationship between skills and area of success. Human capital really does appear to be the bedrock on which urban economies rest. And this started with the work of Jim Rausch 22 years ago, 23 years ago, and Enrico Moretti very much made this topic his own. This is a picture of it. This is actually per capita GDP across metropolitan areas and share of adults with college degrees in the US. It is remarkable, right, that within the US you have gaps of fourfold between the least productive parts of America and the most productive parts of America. And it is also remarkable that they line up so closely with skills. This is residualized. This is wages versus share of the population with a college degree. And here you really are going to see some differences. But they're not differences that lead you to conclude that skills are less important in the developing world. The differences that lead you to conclude that skills are actually much more important in the city's developing world. So these are our coefficients. The US coefficient is about 1, meaning that as a share of the population with a college degree increases by about 10%, your wages go up by about 10%. That figure for Brazil and India in the broad regression is about 3. When you control for density, it rises to times about 2, so it's 3 times as large. In China, the coefficient is 6, right? Enormous coefficients on skills and success. And some sense because the developing world just has an incredible variety of economies, right? A growing economy like China has some places that feel like they're back in the 1970s, that feel like they're places of poverty, and some places that feel like they're the cutting edge. You go to Shenzhen, right? You feel like you're on the edge of the economic future of the world, right? And that exists within a single country, and skills predict which of those areas look better and which of those areas look worse. Skills also predict growth, and this is across America's counties. I've just sorted the counties from the least skilled to the most skilled. They're just simple quintiles. Population growth in the most skilled is about 4 times higher than in the least skilled areas. When we look at skills and growth, we can look at both income growth and population growth. Typically for urban work, you look at both, because in fact populations are mobile, and especially mobile populations, in fact, could see extra productivity showing with just more population, not at all with added income. But the effects show up in both. In the US, coefficients are like 2 on in change in population and 0.6 in change in income. More population effects than income effects. In the case of Brazil, the effects are much, much larger, and they're larger for income than they are for population. So in some sense, the productivity effect on earnings is larger than the productivity effect on employment for Brazil. Just enormously strong effects. In the case of China, the income effects are fairly muted. It's actually negative if you don't control for initial income because mean reversion is so strong in Chinese cities. It's positive but insignificant if you do control for it, although the coefficients are quite large. The effect on population growth is just enormously strong over this time period. And in India, the effect is actually much weaker, and we actually don't have income growth in India over this time period. So if anything, all of these 3 effects, agglomeration effects, population and income and education, and education and urban growth, these things seem to be as strong in the developing world as they are in the US. Again, I don't have this data for Africa, but I would be very surprised if it paints a picture that's totally different from Brazil, India, China, and the US, where indeed both skills and agglomeration seem to be the lifeblood of economic success. Now, there is a fact that actually doesn't come out, which is one of the great facts of the US. You can see it there, which is the relationship between earnings and wages and rents. So people in the US, places where people earn higher wages are also places that have higher living costs. That's natural, right? You expect there to be a spatial equilibrium. You expect there to be no free lunch at the local level. That's true in Brazil. It's kind of true in China, although it gets messier. The Indian data, it doesn't show up at all. Okay, it doesn't show up at all. Now, I think there are 3 possible interpretations of this. One of which is the Indian data that we have here is just crap. It's entirely possible. Second of which is that Indian rental markets are so screwed up by the institutions of housing in India that these are accurate depicting rents, but the rents are not in any sense capturing a free market for rents. And the third of which is that India just has not evolved a spatial equilibrium at this point in time. I don't know the answer. Again, it's something that's worthwhile knowing. It's something that's very much worthwhile knowing for Africa as well. Now, I'm going to segue to talking about my work with Nikhil Naik, who is the computer scientist who's responsible for this visual recognition stuff on measuring streetscapes. And this is very much motivated by the observation that the data was crap, or may have been crap, because in fact there are ways that we have of dealing with situations in which official data can be really problematic. And this is an image from Google Street View. I think this is Dhaka. And this in some sense borrows from what Vernon and others did with streetlights, with nightlights, which was an earlier technology of using data from third-party providers, from satellites, to measure income. And that work was fantastic. But think about how much richer this is than a nightlight in terms of telling you how much is going on. Think about how much more you get from a streetscape about the wealth and poverty, or think about other things. Think about measuring how well the streets are paved. Think about measuring the nature of commerce. I mean, you can get so much out of this picture. So we have not managed to get this work for Indonesia yet. We're trying to do this for Indonesia and then Chile. We have done it for the US. It's actually not particularly useful. But what we have done is shown at least the ability of pictures to predict income. So what we've done is for New York City, we've started with these Google Street View images, and we're then going to take block group income, and we're essentially going to regress income on the pixels. Okay? So don't ask me exactly how this is done. It involves things that are called random forests and machine learning, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. But you're essentially running a regression where you're regressing income on the pixels. Okay? And no, it doesn't particularly pick on one thing about the image. It sort of uses the whole stuff. It uses all this stuff which computer vision guys have been doing for 90 years, trying to figure out from a picture, is it a face? If it is a face, is it your face? And the computer actually recognizes that. It's the same technology, and we're essentially using it to predict income. So you've got a bunch of training examples, so we've got a bunch of different images, where we've got images, we've got income, and typically you split your sample into training and testing. As you can imagine, the number, in some sense, of explanatory variables in all the pixels on an image is huge. So the possibility for overfitting is enormous. So you always have to do a training, testing, sample structure. So we take a bunch of training examples here, we then regress them on the pixels, so there's our pseudo-regression of the pixels, and then we get a predicted income from the pixels. Okay? So what does this look like? So you get an R-squared of 85%, right, with the pixels for the training sample. Okay? That's perhaps too high, that's artificially fit. For the testing sample, you get an R-squared of 81%. It's fairly astounding. Now I should say, in Blavatnik, we are starting to work on this in Indonesia, and the R-squared is much lower. So we're having a much harder time of fitting Islam and Jakarta than we are fitting the neighborhoods of New York. And we'll have to see if it's actually usable for the developing world, because right now it's not really fitting. But at least in the US, this has at least a remarkable promise for being able to predict income. And think about other things that can be done for this. Think about automating the process of property appraisal, right? So a business in which you have people go out and appraise properties, all that you're getting from all those people that you're sending around neighborhood is their eyes. You shouldn't need their eyes. These are their eyes. These are all their eyes are getting. You can get rid of them. You can get rid of the expense of them. You can get rid of the whole discretion that comes, the potential for bribery, the potential for corruption, if you automate the appraisals with pictures. Now, we even use the same New York sample for Boston, and it turns out the New York model, trained only on New York model, gives us 86% R-squared on Boston. So at least within the northeastern United States, the thing does transfer. I don't think it would do very well for Houston. I certainly don't think it would do very well for the South, but it's at least shows some possibility. Now, one of the facts that's known in the U.S., and it's been known for 50 years intuitively and known for 25 years in the data, is the relationship between entrepreneurship and urban resilience. 50 years ago, the economist Benjamin Chinitz was comparing New York to Pittsburgh, and noting that New York was seemed to be more resilient than Pittsburgh did even then. He argued that this was a reflection, a residual, of New York's industrial history, the legacy of the garment industry in New York, which had been New York's dominant industry, in which anyone with a good idea and a couple of sewing machines could get started. By contrast, Pittsburgh, because of its rivers, and most of all because of its coal mines, had U.S. Steel, an industry with very large returns to scale, in which who can compete with U.S. Steel. And so U.S. Steel bred company men, not entrepreneurs. Now, what's interesting is that those entrepreneurs created by the garment industry in New York seem to have gone on to do different things. They worked in finance, they built skyscrapers, they started movie studios. In some sense, entrepreneurialism and capitalism, it works across different things. Now, it's remarkable given how imperfect our measures of entrepreneurship are, how well they do at predicting employment growth across American cities. We've known this for the past 60 years in terms of the data. These are the places with the smallest average establishments. These are the places with the largest average establishments. Something like a ratio of 4 to 1 in terms of employment growth. This is true within metropolitan areas, across industries. This is true across metropolitan areas within a single industry. This is true just in the Sun Belt. This is true just in the Rust Belt. This is true when you use things like the presence of coal mines in 1900 as an instrument for the presence of large firms in 1960 or 1980. It's a very robust fact in the U.S. Now, it's open to interpretation. I like the word entrepreneurship to describe it, but really it's a fact about small or new firms predicting subsequent employment growth. We do not have this data in the same way for the developing world. We do not know the extent to which entrepreneurialism and capital matter. And we do not know in particular that there's so many rich challenges around entrepreneurship in developing world cities. The problem of small firms, small families, growing up into middle-sized firms, which are so often stopped by the need to formalize, for example, so we don't know the extent to which this entrepreneurial skills will occur, but it seems like it's as important as one can possibly want to know something about. And when I think about the developing world, some of the strongest images I have of entrepreneurship have been there. This is an image of the Durrani slum in Mumbai. And I don't think I've ever been to a more entrepreneurial place than Durrani. Not even Kalingalinga and Lusaka, rivals it, although Kalingalinga is a pretty darn entrepreneurial place. Right? We walk through these places and they're just small firms all over the place. So filled with hope, so filled with energy. Right? And you just feel the promise of the developing world in these entrepreneurial areas. And then you go out in the street and you see a kid defecating in an unpaved road. Right? And the electricity isn't intermittent, and the water isn't fit to drink. And it reminds you of a failures is a useful thing to do. When I think about the challenges of managing urban spaces, I think there's three large-scale failures. One of which is public management failure. In some sense, this is the simple one. This is the one we know about. This is the straight-out corruption, the fact that money goes down a thing and then it flies out the door to some other thing. The second failure is the political failures, which means even if you get the, handle the corruption project, politics still has the ability to produce completely the wrong project in completely the wrong way. Right? So Boston built a $19 billion tunnel called the Big Dig 15 years ago, 20 years ago, right? There have been commissions after commissions. There's not a whiff of corruption that anyone can find out this thing. That does not mean that it was a wise use of $19 billion. The third lesson, the third issue is the legal failures. Private property is unsafe, and that makes it impossible to deal with the negative externalities that we see around them. So here is the example from the West of the great public management failure. This is Tweed's infamous courthouse, one of my personal favorites. You can still visit it in downtown New York. It cost something, I actually don't know the current dollars like this, it cost something like $6 million to produce. It was originally budgeted for $500,000 in the 1860s, right? Money flew out for connected contractors and then flew back into the pockets of Wall Street, right? There's nothing that happened that has happened in the developing world in the past 30 years that is as extreme as Tweed's courthouse in terms of that. We did it right there in New York on a massive scale. Now, I think there are lessons in how New York dealt with that, and I think the most important lesson is that, in fact, the city helped reform itself. And when you think about how African cities will reform, will improve, it's not going to come because the IMF or even the World Bank tells African cities to. It's because it's going to come when the people of those cities, like maybe it's 70 in New York, that led the Reformation, led the fight against Wall Street, that rose up and fought against them. It's going to come because the cities of Africa rise up and change themselves. The second type of failure, this is even more egregious than Big Dig. This was only $300 million. This is Detroit's infamous people mover, and it's infamous because, of course, Detroit is a city that was built for 1.85 million people, and now it's less than half of that, and it's easy to get around Detroit. The streets are empty, right? You could run a bus at any speed you want down the streets of Detroit, and yet what did the city think it needed to make itself anew? It thought it needed a monorail, right, to glide over essentially empty streets. This is the sort of nonsense that infrastructure purveyors push, that somehow or other this infrastructure will transform everything magically. This does not mean that infrastructure investment isn't necessary in many cases, but it's so easy to get it wrong. It's so easy to waste millions and millions and billions of dollars on foolish infrastructure projects, especially when someone else is paying the bill, right? And that's the story here as well as the Washington was paying the bill. So the more that you have the infrastructure paid for by the people who use it, whether or not it's through user fees or at least through local taxation, I think it provides at least some safety, some against sort of these extreme types of action. And I will also say the user fee point is particularly critical when you think about things like roads, right? That in fact, the fundamental law of highway traffic, identified by George Matthew Turner, tells us that in the U.S. at least, vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1 for 1 with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive it, right? The only way to deal with traffic congestion in cities is to actually charge people for the cost of their driving, to have things like electronic road pricing, which I was so pleased to see that Beijing is finally thinking about doing that. Because in fact, that is very clearly the need for this. And certainly, one of the big challenges when you have roads, that once people are used to driving on them for free, it becomes very, very hard to impose congestion pricing later. So the key thing is anytime you get a new highway, price it originally from the beginning. If only just a little bit. Get people used to the idea that infrastructure isn't free, that we should fund it with user charges and they should pay for the cost rather than the idea that this is something that's never going to have a price on it. Now, many of the times when we think about infrastructure in the developing world, it often feels like a tale of two technologies. This is particularly true in South Africa, where often you have these two technologies because you had one that was built for the whites and one that was not built for the whites. And those two things are competing. But think about how many times you have a technology that is, expensive, fancy, right, modern sewer system, and a technology that isn't, train, right? Technology that's fancy, the Gautrain, speeding at fast speeds between Johannesburg and Pretoria, a technology that isn't, the minibuses, cheap and efficient. In terms of, let's see what other examples I have here. Shallow wells versus aqueducts. cheap schools, private security, right? All of these are different versions of less expensive technologies versus more expensive technologies. Right? Now, when you think about these two things in development, there are cases in which you want to focus on situations in which the right technology is to move everyone from the old technology, from a pit latrine to a modern sewer. And there are cases like this. Well, I think probably the Gaussian is the wrong answer. This train is too expensive for most of the development. It's too expensive for the U.S. Right? Actually, the right answer is probably some souped-up, improved version of the minibus. It's not at all moving to the right technology. So when you think about these cases, you need to use some combination of cost-benefit analysis and further research and try and figure out when we want to soup up the secondary technology and when you want to actually nudge everyone towards the primary technology. Now, the problem of moving people to the primary technology, the expensive technology, gets found up when you get to what's called the last mile problem. Many people who engage in construction development will know about this. It's an old problem, and it's a problem that occurs when there exists some degree of investment to create the basic infrastructure, the pipes, the sewers, and so forth. And then people don't want to connect to it. So let's say it costs $1,000 to connect to the sewers. People say, no, I don't want that. I'm happy with my home the way it is. And it's hard to blame them. And the public sector then has to deal with this. They have some strong anti-subsidy bent in the public sector, probably for good reasons. That they'll tell you that if they subsidize water, they have to subsidize agriculture. They don't want to do that. On the other hand, they don't want to penalize people either. So how do we think about this? Well, it turns out that the history of the West also gives us some guidance. So this is a path of death rates in New York City over the past 200 years. And as you can see, New York City is now pretty healthy. In fact, life expectancy is about 3 years longer in New York than they are elsewhere in the country. But that didn't happen easily. Cities and towns of the West didn't become healthy easily. They were spending as much on clean water as the federal government was spending on everything except the post office and the army at the start of the 20th century. The work of Cutler and Miller is probably the best on this. But it's not just about infrastructure. And the reason I know this is the story that I was raised on, the great story of engineering triumphalism in New York, is one in which New York was a filthy place, and then they built the Croton Aqueduct. They built this amazing piece of water infrastructure that brought in the clean waters of upstate down into the city. And then the clean waters flowed, and then the cholera stopped, and then we were healthy, and then we were so lucky for these great engineers. Well, let's just look for a second. I mean, I know we no longer do time series here, but at least maybe we can just look a little bit and see if there's a trend break. So here's when the Croton Aqueduct was opened. Anyone see a trend break after that? Anyone see anything going on for 25 years? In fact, this 1849 cholera epidemic, 7 years after Croton Aqueduct, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather died in that one. Okay? And he would have been very surprised to have known that the Croton Aqueduct had made New York completely safe for people. New York continued to die. New York continued to die because of New York's last mile problem. Right? And this occurred despite subsidies, despite the fact that in the wake of the building of the aqueduct, there were hydrants on the street. And in fact, you could get clean water, but there were only one hydrant every 10 blocks or so. And water is heavy to carry. So people continue to use the old technology, the shallow wells that sit next to the refuse that the city had left around, and they continue to die. Now, what changed? The change actually occurs here with this 1866 Board of Health. This is when things actually start going down. And it goes down slowly, not all at once. But what happens is they actually force people to do it. They impose fines on landowners to actually make them adopt the new technology. It's a punishment strategy. And it's a strategy that actually makes us, scared about applying this to the developing world. Because there are at least two challenges to using something that feels like punishment. One of which is the legal system is untrustworthy. It's untrustworthy in New York as well. The cops were also untrustworthy. The way they handled it was having a separate form of policing that was actually beholden to doctors. It was the Board of Health that actually had control over the inspectors. So they had a parallel policing system. They didn't just trust ordinary cops who would have used their powers. But the second thing, which is really different, and that takes us back to property ownership, is you knew who owned the land. You didn't apply this to renters. You applied this to the landowners, the people who own the tenants. And in a world in which you don't know who owns the land, it becomes very hard to impose obligations. And it reminds us of this central fact that ownership is not just about empowering the owner. It's about imposing obligations on the owner. It's about requiring the owner to actually take responsibility for the land that's under their control. And in a world in which you do not have ownership, is a say something about a paper that I wrote on this issue with Nava Ashraf and Giacomo Ponsetto. And it's about thinking about what the right way to deal with the adoption, the last mile problem is in a world of limited judicial and limited executive trust. And the way that you want to think about it along this axis is the executive group gets more and more incompetent. And along this group, the judicial group becomes more and more corrupt. So this group is bad, this is better judicial group, this is worse executive group up here. So down here, you have a bad judiciary and a bad executive, and the only thing you can do is give up. There's no adoption in this region. When you get the judiciary getting better and better, even if the executive is weak, then you end up in a world in which you use fines, because you can trust the judiciary to administer the fines properly. If you have a middling level of judiciary, you end up using a combination of fines and subsidies. The crucial element for the fine is to make sure that they're small enough in the model, and the model is not a fact about the world, but the model is small enough not to induce extortion of the innocent, right? Because in fact, if you have cops who both extort the innocent and the guilty, you lose any ability to nudge people to the better behavior. And this in some sense sits Gary Becker's 1968 observation of boiling people in oil for double marking, but that's a great strategy on its head. That's exactly the wrong answer in the developing world, probably in the developed world as well. That actually what you want are not large fines that are subject to abuse. What you want is small fines, small nudges, humane punishments. You want to punish someone, you want to punish a kid for defecating on the street in India, punish them by making them read a book for an hour, right? Give them something that is a mild but annoying punishment, not something that is likely to lead to abuse, right? So we have to have rules, but we need to make sure that they're humane rules and are not subject to abuse in these areas. Now, this gets us back to the need for property rights and urban governance. And again, where I started on this was that cities are about interactions, and you need rules in cities to actually manage these interactions, manage the use of clean water, manage the use of crime, and so forth. You need property rights. And for property rights, you need to actually make it attractive for people to actually own property. One of the things we've noticed from many of the titling programs in the world over the past 40 years is people want their titles initially, and then they give up on them because they don't see what it's getting them. Doesn't seem to give them any protection from the state, doesn't seem to give them much protection from other people taking it. And this means we need a world in which we actually want people, have people who actually want their property, where the property is actually worth something, where it's protected. So at the same time, we need to assign property, we need to make sure we're protecting that property. And that issue, right, is particularly keen in areas in which you have a lack of trust in the judiciary. So this is from the World Justice Project. This is the experts' assessment of undue influence over the judges. This is the percentage of cases the experts say come under pressure or corruption. So in the poorer parts of the world, like Cambodia, this can come up to 100%. The experts believe 100% of the cases they've dealt with. So the view that you have some sort of a perfect judiciary is just madness in much of the world. This is the popular perception of undue influence over judges. And the red shows influence from private sector, and the blue shows influence from the government sector. So these are just two large countries, Mexico and China, both very, very high. Of course, it's quite different. In Mexico, the dominant fear is private influence. In China, it's all government. There's no fear of private influence over this stuff. It's all public influence. I'll skip over this. So the possibilities are enormous, but the challenges are real. And moving to a system in which you have well-defined property rights, and it's not going to be easy, and it's going to be gradual and needs to respect the institutions that are currently in place, and most of all, it needs to be led by the citizens of the developing world itself. So it doesn't happen from the outside. Just say two final things. One of which is that as difficult as we may think this is, I think it's important to remember that democratic change, political change, actually historically has come from cities. I call this the Boston hypothesis. But for millennia, cities have been working democratic uprisings, have been working democratic change. Think about when Brutus tore down the Tarquin King 2,500 years ago, or when the weavers and the butchers of Bruges rose up against Philip the Fair of France, or think about when Sam Adams or John Hancock came together in Boston to revolt. Maybe that's a sore subject too. But cities have been making democracy for centuries, and I think if we think that Africa is going to get better governance in the 21st century, get the governance it deserves and can have, it's going to come from cities. And that's yet another reason to invest in our cities. And the last point that was raised was about climate change. I'm not going to say very much on that. I talked about this in many other settings. Development is associated with more carbon use. I And in fact, in the West, we know that cities, in fact, are associated with less carbon usage, not more than 800,000 hypothesis. So you shouldn't view cities as being an enemy of the environment, rather being a friend of the environment, as a way of reducing the carbon impact of people. And in terms of protection from climate change, there are two things that go on simultaneously in cities. One of which is we should worry, and this is yet another reason for good urban governance, we should worry about the vulnerability, particularly of low-lying cities that are close to water, to climate change issues. That is a profound issue that the cities need to think about. But cities also are part of the solution to dealing with the vagaries of climate change, in the sense that if you're part of a global trading world, if you're urbanized, if you're connected, then in fact you in some sense have the insurance that comes from the broad global spread weather. Right? That in fact, if you're a subsistence agriculture and you get hit with a negative weather shock, you're just screwed. If you are part of a global trade network, you can do a little bit more coal centers to get to diamonds in the area to do a little bit more. Right? So in some sense, being part of the global trade network is a way of protecting yourself against climate change. But let me not end on that note. I want to end with two last facts. One of which is this is the relationship between the happiness gap between people in cities and people in rural areas and income. And this is just self-reported happiness. The distance from the zero line shows how much more people in cities say that they're happy relative to rural areas. And notice, in wealthy world, there's no gap at all. If anything, in New Zealand, the rural dwellers, in Italy, the rural dwellers say they're happier. In Sweden and France, the urbanites say that they're happier. But when you move to poorer countries, it really does appear to be true, India, Mali, Ghana, Moldova, Rwanda, that the people in the urban sector say that they're much more happy with their lives than rural dwellers are. And it reminds us that cities aren't just about income in the developing world. They're about opportunity, they're about promise, they're about pleasure, they're about change. And that's what we're all fighting for. We're fighting for trying to make cities that are more humane, more livable, more productive, and ultimately free. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed, for a wonderful presentation. Look, we got time for a couple of questions. I will try to end the session in the next 10 minutes because I know Ed has a plane to catch in London, and I really want to thank...
It's my sixth grader's graduation from
Absolutely.
sixth grade. Apparently, this is something I cannot miss for fear of all sorts of terrible things.
No, you cannot miss. And we're really grateful, Ed. You really made this effort to come here. And let's keep the session of Q&A to just 10 minutes to make sure he doesn't miss his plane. So I'll open up for 2-3 questions maximum. Yes, Paul.
Where you got the diagram of effectively something like state effectiveness versus judicial effectiveness, could you just, that's it, would you mind just spending a couple of minutes explaining it to idiots?
So the A is how effective the judiciary is. So this means the judiciary is less corrupt, essentially. That's how this works in the model. This is how corrupt the executive is. This is how wasteful subsidies become. Okay, so highly effective judiciary, you could just go ahead and use fines because you trust the judiciary. Not going to lead to abuse. You just use the legal system. Highly effective executive, which means this delta is low, you can just use subsidies. And when you're up here, sort of, effective executive, effective judiciary, it doesn't matter. Either way, you've got a great, you're like in Sweden, right? It's all going to work perfectly either way you do it, right? When you're down here, it's the opposite, right? The executive is lousy and the judiciary is lousy. And in this case, give up, right? You can't have this new technology. You just have to use the old technology. So you've got to hope over time your institutions become better. I think the relevant issue for most of the developing world is here. It's this middle range in which you don't really trust the judiciary very much and you don't really trust the executive very much either. And you've got to figure out some balance and you want to do something to induce adoption. Although in some cases, like the Gautrain, you probably are better off trying to figure out how to make the minibuses better. And this range calls for a combination. It calls for punishments that are light and sufficiently light so as not to create extortion of the innocent. But that needs to be, since those punishments are light, they need to be mixed with mild subsidies. So it calls for a mix of the two where you have mild punishments mixed with subsidies. And that's really the point of that. It suggests that sort of you want to use a combination of, you don't want to let people completely off the hook who are landlords who are not connected to the sewers, not doing the water.
Thank you.
I love also this. Do you have something similar for the two-tier of technologies in cities and infrastructure? A same type of framework?
I mean, I think of this as being the same type of. I mean, I think of this as being about the issue of moving from latrines to water, right? So the no adoption means you don't adopt, and all the other reasons are ones in which you do adopt the two.
You indicated, and it's very common what is seeing right now in Africa. The high-speed train, the latrine, and the matatu type of technology, and the decision of the policymakers in terms of the budget constraints. Do you have a framework to think about it?
Well, I don't know that I have anything that's all that novel. I think the difference between just using normal cost-benefit analysis to think about this, and I think it starts anytime you start with trains, you've got to start with cost-benefit analysis. Is you've got to imagine what it would take to make the minibuses better. So right now, usually what you do is you think about the train in absence of any other interventions. You do a cost-benefit analysis on the train, and you say, look, this is our current thing. What's our other thing? The thing that's I think more exciting is to think what you can do with the minibuses or the alternative technology to up it in various ways. In some cases, I think it's just not, so the equivalent of doing that for the case of water is with tablets, right? And tablets are probably the right answer for much of the rural world. It cannot be the right answer for a city of 10 million people in 2050 that we're just going to have, filthy water and tablets. I hesitate to bring this up. In the 1993 WDR, it was pointed out that we don't need to worry about subsidizing. We shouldn't subsidize water. It was a generally sort of anti-subsidized thing because, after all, we always have antibiotics. And it is certainly true that the cholera epidemics of the 21st century are much milder than the cholera epidemics of the 19th century because of this. That's certainly right. But it's an open question the extent to which the rise of antibiotic-resistant disease, particularly in India, reflects the fact that we haven't invested in these technologies and have tried to do it all with large amounts of antibiotics. And I think almost assuredly the right thing for thinking about whether or not it's water or cars is to think about how we can up the quality of this thing without going all the way to the other thing. And that might involve technology that's a little bit more like Uber for the minibuses, might involve some degree of synchronization, might involve something that involves more safety around the minibuses as well. Turkey, I think, and particularly Istanbul, is an example of a place that sort of moved from very traditional minibuses to something that's more organized and more functional. So it's sort of gradualist upgrading rather than a complete 1-0 thing.
Very good. One last question? Probably, yeah. Okay, two last, and yes. Could you introduce yourself, please, for the rest of us?
Agreed. I like the street view methodology, but we've just had in India last week them extending their ban on street view. And I think the same thing is likely to happen in African countries. How could you persuade African countries that it's a net benefit to use such systems?
Well, yeah, and so there is an Indian alternative provider that we're using for India. There's a domestic provider. How do I persuade India to change their policy on Google? I don't know how to do that. I wish we could, obviously, but I've only gotten so far as thinking that we use a domestic alternative. But I think we certainly should try and the benefits of having new technology are enormous, and banning things like street view has all sorts of ancillary costs that are important to think about. So I'm happy to say something, but I don't know that I can have any effect on this. But yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Dave Evans from the World Bank. I appreciate this idea that the demand for political accountability and positive shifts in governance will come from cities. But one narrative in African history is that cities have driven, rather than necessarily improvements in governance, have simply driven better rents for urban dwellers. So why would we necessarily believe, for example, that cities would lead us towards better overall governance as opposed to simply, improving the lot of them at the expense, especially in places where you can take advantage of, impose significant taxes on agriculture in order to benefit cities?
So I don't think of urbanization. It's a great question. I don't think of urbanization as being the cause of the rentier economy. So my model of this, which I guess I wrote this paper called Trade and Circuses, explaining urban giants 24 years ago. That was on this stuff, where I thought that the evidence suggested that places that were unstable regimes or dictatorships had very large primate cities, in part because the people crowd around power like ants do around a picnic, right? So you have the power, you have the wealth in the central city, and then people come around it, and by putting pressure or lobbying or kowtowing to the powerful, they get the rents. That would have been my model. In fact, it's that it's rent-driven urbanization rather than urbanization-driven renting. And I think you're right. It's more of a hypothesis than a fact. I still think that having people in a bourgeois urban, setting for decades, maybe centuries, leads to the habits, the coordination that actually can lead to a push for democratic change. At least that would be, so, my model for this would be Paris, right, which is also a regime dominated by royal control over the hinterland and the flow of wealth from the hinterland to the city. People crowd around that, and eventually, they kill a king. And it takes them a while to get to functional democracy or functional, but it does move in that direction eventually.
On this very, very good note, let's give a big round of applause to Maka and yes.
And once again, really good, and thank you very much for making it happen. The back and forth has been a great contribution to our conference. Thank you so very much.
So now, Marcus, please.
Coffee's outside. We'll move to the next session. Please be on time. It'll be at 11 in the breakout rooms, which are across the common area.